The cutting December wind swept through Detroit's deserted streets with a ferocity that seemed intent on tearing the soul from anyone who dared defy it. It was one of those nights when even the bravest preferred to stay home, warmed by the heat of their fireplaces, away from the brutal reality that dominated the streets of the Motor City. But Vincent "Vinny" Torino wasn't like most people. At 52 years old, he had built an empire in Detroit's shadows, controlling territories that stretched from downtown to the industrial suburbs, where the smokestacks of old factories still smoldered like ghosts of a more prosperous past. Vinny walked the streets with the confidence of someone who knew every alley, every corner, every secret the city kept. His Italian wool overcoat protected him from the cold, but couldn't warm the ice that had formed in his heart over decades of building and maintaining his criminal empire. His footsteps echoed on the wet asphalt, creating a hypnotic rhythm that mixed with the distant sound of traffic on I-75 and the occasional moan of wind between abandoned buildings. This wasn't a casual walk. Vinny was making his weekly rounds, a tradition he'd maintained since taking control of the Torino family 15 years ago. He believed a leader should know his territory intimately, feel the pulse of the streets, identify problems before they became crises. His men followed at a respectful distance, Tony the Hammer Benedetto and Marco Quick Fingers Rossi, two veterans who had served the family for more than 2 decades. "Boss, it's colder than hell tonight," murmured Tony, adjusting his coat collar while observing the dark windows of surrounding buildings. "Maybe we should head back to the club." Salvatore said he had some issues to discuss about the East Side territories. Vinny nodded but didn't slow his pace. 5 more minutes, Tony. I want to check the alley behind the old Chrysler warehouse. I heard rumors that some kids are using the place to sell drugs without our permission." The alley in question was one of Detroit's many forgotten corners, a labyrinth of concrete and rusted metal that served as a silent witness to urban decay. Dumpsters overflowed with debris that the wind scattered like macabre confetti, and the walls were covered with graffiti that told stories of despair and rebellion. It was the kind of place where dirty business was conducted and where people disappeared without a trace. When Vinny turned the corner and entered the alley, a strange sensation invaded him. It wasn't fear. He had overcome that emotion long ago. It was something different, an uneasiness he couldn't explain. The wind seemed stronger there, creating an almost supernatural sound as it passed between buildings. Shadows danced under the weak light of a street lamp that flickered intermittently, creating an atmosphere that seemed straight out of a film noir. That's when he heard it. A sound so faint that initially he thought it was just the wind, or perhaps a lost cat. But there was something different about that sound, something that made his heart race in a way he hadn't felt in years. He stopped abruptly, raising his hand to signal that his men should do the same. "Did you hear that?" whispered Vinny, his dark eyes scanning the shadows around them. Tony and Marco exchanged confused looks. "Hear what, boss?" asked Marco, his hand instinctively moving toward the weapon hidden under his coat. Vinny remained motionless, concentrating intensely. And then he heard it again, a weak cry, almost inaudible, that seemed to come from somewhere near a pile of garbage at the end of the alley. It wasn't the cry of an animal. It was something much more disturbing, and at the same time, touching. "Stay here," ordered Vinny, beginning to walk slowly toward the sound. Each step seemed to echo like thunder in his ears, and he could feel his heart beating with an intensity he hadn't experienced since his early days in organized crime. As he approached the pile of garbage, the crying became clearer, more desperate. That's when he saw it. A dark canvas bag, partially hidden among wet cardboard boxes and torn garbage bags. The bag moved slightly, and the sound was definitely coming from inside it, with hands that trembled imperceptibly, something that surprised him as his hands never trembled. Vinny knelt beside the bag. The smell of the alley was nauseating, a mixture of decomposing garbage, urine, and the metallic odor of rain on rusted metal. But there was something more, something that made him swallow hard, the unmistakable smell of human despair. Carefully, he untied the knot that kept the bag closed. His hands, which had held weapons, signed death sentences, and built an empire based on fear, now worked with a delicacy he didn't know he possessed. When he finally managed to open the bag, what he saw hit him like a punch to the stomach. Inside the bag was a baby, a girl, from what he could see, no more than a few months old. Her skin was bluish from the cold, and she was wrapped only in a thin blanket that barely offered protection against Detroit's freezing wind. Her small fists were clenched, and she cried with a strength that seemed impossible for something so small and fragile. But it was when she opened her eyes, large, dark, and full of an innocence that contrasted brutally with the surrounding environment, that Vinny felt something break inside his chest. The child looked directly at him, and for an impossible moment it seemed like she recognized him. And then, in a voice so small it could have been just his imagination, he heard the word that would change his life forever. "Mommy!" The word came from the baby's tiny lips like a whisper, but to Vinny it sounded like a scream that echoed through all the walls he had built around his heart. He was paralyzed, looking into those innocent eyes that seemed to see through all his defenses, all his masks, straight to the soul he had tried to bury under decades of violence and cynicism. "Boss, is everything okay?" Tony's voice came from far away, as if he was speaking through a tunnel. Vinny couldn't respond. His hands, which had taken lives without hesitation, now trembled as he extended his fingers toward the child. When his fingers touched the baby's cold skin, he felt an electric current run through his entire body. It was as if all the years of emotional hardening were being undone in a single moment. The baby stopped crying when she felt Vinny's touch. Her small fingers closed around his index finger with surprising strength, and she looked at him with a trust that left him speechless. It was as if, somehow, she knew she was safe now. "Jesus Christ," murmured Vinny, his voice hoarse with an emotion he hadn't felt in decades. Who would do such a thing? Who would abandon a child to die in the cold? He looked around the alley, searching for clues, for any sign of who could have committed such an act. But there was nothing, just the wind, the cold, and the brutal reality that someone had decided this small life was worth nothing. Carefully, Vinny removed his own coat and wrapped the baby in it. The coat was too big, but it was warm and dry, and he could see immediately that the child was beginning to warm up. She made a small sound of contentment and nestled against the fabric, her eyes slowly closing. "Boss?" Tony had approached, and his voice carried genuine concern. "What did you find?" Vinny stood slowly, holding the baby against his chest with an instinctive protection that surprised him. "Someone abandoned this child here to die," he said, his voice loaded with a cold anger that his men knew well. "A baby. Can't be more than 3 or 4 months old." Tony and Marco approached, their hardened faces softening when they saw the small form wrapped in their boss's coat. Both were men who had seen and done terrible things, but there was something about the absolute innocence of a child that touched even the most hardened hearts. "My God," whispered Marco, removing his own hat in an unconscious gesture of respect. "Who would do this to a child?" "Someone who's going to pay dearly when I find out," replied Vinny, his voice loaded with a dark promise. But then he looked down at the baby in his arms, and his expression softened again. "But now, our priority is taking care of her." The baby had fallen asleep, her small, regular breathing creating little clouds of vapor in the cold air. Vinny could feel the warmth of her small body through the coat, and something inside him, something he thought had died long ago, began to awaken. "Tony, call Dr. Castellano. Tell him it's an emergency and I need him at the club immediately. And Marco..." Vinny paused, looking once more at the child in his arms. "I want you to find out everything about this alley. Talk to all our contacts in the area. Someone saw something. Someone knows who did this." "Yes, boss," both men responded in unison. But Vinny could see the confusion in their eyes. In all the years they had worked for him, they had never seen him act like this. The Vincent Torino they knew was calculating, cold, relentless. This man holding an abandoned baby with the tenderness of a father was someone completely different. As they walked back through Detroit's streets toward the club that served as the Torino family headquarters, Vinny couldn't stop looking at the child in his arms. She had awakened once during the walk, and when their eyes met again, she had smiled, a small, perfect smile that made something inside Vinny's chest tighten in a way he couldn't explain. "What are we going to call her, boss?" asked Tony as they approached the club, a discreet establishment on a side street that didn't attract attention, but which everyone in the neighborhood knew was Torino family territory. Vinny stopped in front of the door, looking down at the baby who had changed his life in a matter of minutes. She was awake now, her large, curious eyes observing the world around her, with an innocence that contrasted brutally with the environment she found herself in. "Esperanza," he said finally, his voice soft. "We'll call her Esperanza, because she brought something I thought I had lost forever." And as they entered the club, Vinny knew his life had changed irrevocably. The man who had entered that alley was a mob boss hardened by time and circumstances. The man who came out was something different, someone who had rediscovered that even in the darkest heart, light could still exist. The baby in his arms represented more than just a saved life. She represented a chance for redemption, an opportunity to be something more than just a criminal. And as Vinny looked into those innocent eyes, he made a silent promise. He would protect this child with his life, and perhaps in the process, find a way to protect what remained of his own soul. The Detroit wind continued to blow outside, cold and relentless, but inside the club, something had changed. A small light had been lit in the darkness, and Vincent Torino was determined not to let it go out. The interior of the Torino family club was a study in contrasts. Discreet elegance masking absolute power. Italian leather furniture mixed with carefully selected artwork, while the aroma of Cuban cigars and Scottish whiskey hung in the air like expensive perfume. It was a place where decisions affecting the entire city were made in whispered conversations, where loyalties were tested, and where Vincent Torino's word was absolute law. But on this night, the usual atmosphere of calculated business and silent power was completely transformed by the presence of an unexpected little visitor. Vinny entered the club carrying Esperanza with the care of someone holding the most precious object in the world. The men who were gathered in the main room, hardened veterans who had seen everything on Detroit streets, stopped their conversations and looked with a mixture of surprise and confusion. Never in all the years they had known their boss had they seen him display such tenderness. "Salvatore," called Vinny, addressing his right-hand man, a 45-year-old man with scars that told stories of street battles. "I need you to clear my office, now." Salvatore Sal Benedetto, Tony's younger brother, immediately rose from his armchair, but his eyes remained fixed on the small bundle in his boss's arms. "Of course, Vinny. But what?" "Questions later," interrupted Vinny, his voice carrying the authority everyone knew, but tempered with something new, a protective urgency that none of them had heard before. "And have someone get diapers, bottles, formula, everything a baby needs. I don't care if they have to wake up half the city to get it." The baby in his arms began to stir, making small sounds that could have been discomfort or simply curiosity about the new environment. Vinny instinctively rocked her gently, a movement that seemed to come from somewhere deep in his memory, perhaps from a time when he himself had been cared for with such affection. "Boss," said Frankie, the accountant Moretti, a thin man with glasses who handled the family's finances. "Not to intrude, but where did this child come from?" Vinny looked around the room, seeing the confused and worried faces of his men. These were men who would follow him to hell if he asked, who had spilled blood in his name and who never questioned his decisions. But now, all of them seemed lost, trying to understand how their relentless leader had become, in a matter of minutes, a protective father figure. "I found her abandoned in an alley," said Vinny, his voice low but loaded with cold anger. "Someone left her there to die in the cold, an innocent child thrown away like garbage." The silence that followed was heavy, loaded with a collective indignation that transcended the differences between hardened criminals. There were certain lines that even men like them didn't cross, and hurting a child was definitely beyond those lines. "Son of a bitch," muttered Big Mike Torino, Vinny's distant cousin and one of the organization's most feared men. His enormous hands closed into fists, and everyone in the room could see the genuine anger in his eyes. "Who does that to a child?" "That's exactly what we're going to find out," replied Vinny, looking down when Esperanza opened her eyes and looked at him with that same trusting expression that had melted his defenses in the alley. "But first, we're going to take care of her." Dr. Giuseppe Castellano arrived 20 minutes later, carrying a medical bag and wearing the worried expression of someone who had been awakened in the middle of the night for an emergency. At 60 years old, he had been the Torino family's private doctor for more than a decade, treating wounds that couldn't be treated in conventional hospitals and keeping secrets that could destroy lives. "Vincent, what happened?" he asked, entering the office that Salvatore had quickly transformed into a more suitable space for a child. Tony said it was an emergency involving a child. Vinny was sitting in his leather chair, but the scene was surreal. The feared mob boss gently holding a baby, whispering soft words in Italian that he hadn't spoken in years. "Doctor, I need you to examine her. I want to make sure she's okay." Dr. Castellano approached, his professional eyes immediately assessing the situation. "May I?" he asked, extending his hands. Vinny hesitated for a moment, an instinctive reluctance to let the child leave his arms. But then carefully, he transferred Esperanza to the doctor's experienced hands. The baby protested briefly, her small arms reaching toward Vinny, and he felt a pang in his chest that surprised him with its intensity. "She's approximately 3 months old," said Dr. Castellano after a careful examination. "And considering the circumstances, she's in surprisingly good condition, slightly dehydrated and with signs of cold exposure, but nothing that can't be treated with proper care." "And how long was she out there?" asked Vinny, his voice tense. "Hard to say for certain, but from her condition, I'd say no more than a few hours. You found her just in time." The doctor paused, looking at Vinny with a curious expression. "Vincent, may I ask what your plans are for the child?" It was a question that Vinny had avoided asking himself since the moment he found Esperanza. Logically, he knew he should turn her over to the authorities, let the system take care of her. But every time he thought about separating from the child, something inside him rebelled violently. "She stays with me," he said finally, the words coming out with a certainty that surprised him. "I'm going to take care of her." Dr. Castellano frowned. "Vincent, you understand the implications of this? Taking care of a child is an enormous responsibility, especially considering your line of work." "I know exactly what I'm doing," replied Vinny, extending his arms to receive Esperanza back. When she nestled against his chest, he felt a sense of completeness he hadn't experienced in decades. This child was abandoned to die, and I saved her. That means she's my responsibility now. At that moment, Salvatore entered the office carrying several bags. "I got everything you asked for, Vinny. Diapers, bottles, formula, clothes." The Fifth Avenue pharmacy wasn't very happy about opening in the middle of the night, but a few right words solved the situation. Vinny nodded, but his attention was focused on Esperanza, who had begun making small sounds that he interpreted as hunger. "Doctor, can you show me how to prepare a bottle?" The next hour was a completely new experience for Vincent Torino. The man who commanded a criminal empire with an iron fist found himself learning to mix formula, test temperature on the inside of his wrist, hold a bottle at the correct angle. His men watched in respectful silence, some clearly touched by the transformation they were witnessing in their leader. When Esperanza finally fed and fell asleep in his arms, Vinny felt a peace he hadn't known in years. He looked down at the small, serene face and made a silent promise that echoed through every fiber of his being. He would protect this child, no matter the cost. "Sal," he said softly, so as not to wake the baby, "I want you to organize a meeting with all the family heads tomorrow night, and I want you to spread the word on the streets. Any information about who abandoned this child will be generously rewarded." "How generously?" asked Salvatore. 50,000 for information leading to the person responsible," replied Vinny, his voice loaded with a dark promise. And when I find whoever did this—" He didn't finish the sentence, but everyone in the room understood. Vincent Torino's justice would be swift and final. As the night progressed, the club gradually emptied, leaving only Vinny and some of his closest men. He had improvised a crib using drawers from his filing cabinet, lined with soft towels, but found he couldn't separate from Esperanza for more than a few minutes. "Boss," said Tony softly, "you should get some rest. We can keep an eye on her." Vinny shook his head. "No, she just went through the trauma of being abandoned. She needs to know she's safe now." He paused, looking at his men's worried faces. "I know this is strange for you. Hell, it's strange for me too. But when I saw her in that alley, when she looked at me, something changed." "It's not strange, boss," said Marco, his voice surprisingly soft. "It's human, and maybe it's exactly what we all needed to see." As the first lights of dawn began to filter through the club's windows, Vinny remained awake, watching Esperanza sleep. He thought about his own childhood, the hard streets of Detroit that had molded him into the man he became. He thought about the choices he had made, the blood he had spilled, the empire he had built on foundations of fear and violence. But now, looking at this small, innocent life that had entered his world so unexpectedly, he began to imagine a different future, not just for him, but for his entire organization. Maybe it was possible to build something better, something this child could one day look at with pride instead of shame. Esperanza stirred in his arms, her small lips curving into something that could have been a smile. And in that moment, Vincent Torino, the man who had spent decades building walls around his heart, felt those barriers begin to crumble. "I promise you, little one," he whispered, his voice hoarse with emotion, "that you'll never know the kind of abandonment you felt last night. You'll have a family, a home, and all the love I can give." And as the sun rose over Detroit, illuminating a city that had seen so much suffering and despair, a new story was beginning. A story of redemption, of unexpected love, and of how a small life can change the course of many others. Vincent Torino's empire still existed. His operations still functioned. His men still respected and feared him. But now there was something more. A reason to be better. A motivation to build a legacy that was more than just power and fear. Esperanza had brought hope not just for herself, but for everyone around her. And this was just the beginning. 3 weeks had passed since that fateful night in the alley, and the Torino Family Club had transformed almost beyond recognition. What had once been a masculine sanctuary of dark business and whispered conversations now echoed with completely different sounds. The occasional cry of a baby, the clinking of bottles being prepared, and something even more surprising, the sound of genuine laughter. Vincent Torino had adapted to fatherhood with a determination that surprised even his most loyal men. The man who once slept only 3 hours a night, always alert for threats and opportunities, now organized his entire life around Esperanza's feeding and sleeping schedules. His office had been partially converted into an improvised nursery, complete with a mahogany crib he had specially made, colorful mobiles that contrasted strangely with the weapons stored in the nearby safe, and stacks of diapers that occupied the space where illicit business documents once lay. On this particular January morning, Vinny was sitting in his leather chair, holding Esperanza while she played with the buttons of his Italian shirt. The child had grown visibly in the past weeks, her eyes becoming more alert and expressive, her skin recovering the healthy pink color that the cold had almost taken away. She had developed the habit of smiling whenever she saw Vinny, a smile that had the power to completely melt the defenses of Detroit's most feared man. "She's getting bigger every day," observed Dr. Castellano, who had become a regular visitor to the club, monitoring Esperanza's development with the care of a devoted grandfather. "And smarter too. Look how she observes everything around her." It was true. Esperanza had developed an intense curiosity about her environment, her large eyes following every movement, every sound. She seemed particularly fascinated by Vinny's men, who had one by one succumbed to her innocent charm. Big Mike, the intimidating giant who could break bones with his bare hands, now spoke to her in a soft, caring voice that no one knew he possessed. Salvatore had become an expert at making funny faces that made her laugh, and even Frankie, the always serious accountant, had been seen humming Italian lullabies while organizing the account books. "Vinny," said Salvatore, entering the office with a serious expression that contrasted with the domestic atmosphere. "We have news about the investigation." Vinny looked up, his expression immediately hardening. In the past 3 weeks, he had mobilized all his organization's resources to discover who had abandoned Esperanza. The reward had increased to $100,000, and practically every informant in the city was working on the case. But so far, the leads had been frustrating and inconclusive. "What did you find?" asked Vinny, his voice low so as not to frighten Esperanza, who had fallen asleep in his arms. "Marco found a woman who works the night shift at Detroit Medical Center. She remembers a young girl who gave birth about a month ago, alone, without identification documents. The girl disappeared from the hospital before they could ask routine questions." Vinny felt a mixture of anger and something that could have been compassion. "Continue. The description matches a girl that some of our contacts saw in the area where you found Esperanza. Dark hair, very young, maybe 16 or 17 years old. She looked scared, desperate." Salvatore paused, clearly uncomfortable with what he had to say next. "Vinny, there's more. We discovered she might be involved with drugs. Not as a dealer, but as a user." Vinny's jaw tightened, but he forced his voice to remain calm. "Where is she now?" "We're still looking." "But Vinny," Salvatore hesitated, looking at Esperanza sleeping peacefully in his boss's arms. "Are you sure you want to find her? I mean, if she was using drugs, if she abandoned the child, maybe it's better to leave things as they are." Vinny looked down at Esperanza's serene face. In the past weeks, he had allowed himself to imagine that she was really his daughter, that somehow fate had conspired to bring her into his life. The idea of confronting the biological mother, of potentially having to make difficult decisions about the child's future, filled him with an anxiety he wasn't used to feeling. "No," he said finally, his voice firm. "I need to know the truth. Esperanza deserves to know the truth. And if there's a chance, even a small one, that her mother can be helped." He didn't finish the sentence, but Salvatore understood. Despite all his hardness, Vincent Torino had always had a peculiar moral code. He could be ruthless with enemies and traitors, but there were certain lines he didn't cross, certain vulnerabilities that awakened his protection rather than his predation. That afternoon, while Esperanza slept in her crib, Vinny received a call that would change everything. It was Marco, and his voice carried an urgency that made Vinny's heart race. "Boss, we found her, the baby's mother, but you need to come here now. She's in a very bad situation." Vinny felt a knot form in his stomach. "Where?" "Sunrise Motel on 8 Mile Road, room 237. And Vinny, bring Dr. Castellano. She's going to need medical help." The Sunrise Motel was exactly the kind of place Vinny expected. A decadent establishment that asked few questions and accepted cash payment. The parking lot was full of old cars and some motorcycles, and the smell of cigarettes and despair seemed to permeate the very air. Vinny climbed the external stairs with Dr. Castellano at his side, each step echoing like a war drum in his ears. Marco was waiting outside room 237, his somber expression saying everything Vinny needed to know before even entering. "How is she?" asked Dr. Castellano, already opening his medical bag. "Bad," Marco replied simply. "Very bad." Vinny took a deep breath and opened the door. The room was small and dirty, with peeling wallpaper and a musty smell that made eyes water. But it was the figure on the bed that made Vinny stop abruptly. It was a girl, no more than 17 years old, with tangled dark hair and pale skin that seemed almost translucent. She was conscious, but her eyes had the glassy quality of someone under the influence of heavy drugs. Who are you?" she asked, her voice weak and hoarse. "I didn't do anything wrong." Dr. Castellano immediately approached, his medical instincts taking control. "I'm a doctor," he said softly. "I'm here to help. What's your name?" "Maria," she whispered, trying to sit up in bed, but clearly struggling against weakness. Maria Santos, please. I don't have money to pay for a doctor. Vinny approached slowly, his emotions in conflict. This was the person who had abandoned Esperanza to die in the cold. But looking at her now, he saw not a monster, but a frightened and desperate child. Maria, he said, his voice surprisingly gentle, did you recently have a baby? Maria's eyes immediately filled with tears, and she began to tremble. I couldn't take care of her. I had no choice. I was very sick, and I had no money, and where is the baby now? Asked Vinny, although he already knew the answer. I left her where someone could find her, sobbed Maria. I thought someone who could take better care of her than I could would find her. I didn't want to hurt her. I love her, but I couldn't. Dr. Castellano had finished his preliminary examination and approached Vinny with a grave expression. She's in severe withdrawal, he whispered. Heroin, from what I can see. And she's malnourished and dehydrated. She needs immediate medical treatment. Vinny looked at Maria, who had curled up in a ball in the corner of the bed, sobbing uncontrollably. Part of him wanted to feel anger, wanted to blame her for what Esperanza had gone through. But all he could see was a child who had made an impossible decision under desperate circumstances. Maria, he said, sitting carefully on the edge of the bed, your daughter is safe. I found her, and she's well cared for. Maria lifted her head, her eyes filling with desperate hope. She's alive. She's okay. She's more than okay, replied Vinny, feeling a strange emotion seeing the relief on the young mother's face. She's healthy, happy, and being loved. Can I see her? Asked Maria, trying to get up again. Vinny exchanged a look with Dr. Castellano, who shook his head almost imperceptibly. First, you need to take care of yourself, said Vinny. You need to get clean, get healthy. Your daughter deserves a mother who can take proper care of her. I want that, said Maria, grabbing Vinny's hand with surprising strength. I want to get clean. I want to be a good mother to her, but I don't know how. I don't have anyone. I don't have money for treatment. Vinny felt something move inside his chest, a decision forming before he could even think completely about the implications. You have someone now, he said. I'll pay for your treatment, the best money can buy. But you have to really want it, Maria. You have to be willing to fight for it. I am, she said, tears running down her face. I swear I am. I just want a chance to be the mother she deserves. In the hours that followed, Vinny organized everything. Maria would be admitted to a private and discreet rehabilitation clinic where she would receive the best available treatment. Dr. Castellano would personally supervise her medical care, and Vinny would ensure she had everything she needed to recover. But while they waited for the ambulance that would take Maria to the clinic, Vinny couldn't stop thinking about Esperanza, the child who had become the center of his world, who had awakened feelings he thought he had lost forever. The idea of eventually having to return her to Maria filled him with a pain he didn't know how to process. Vinny, said Dr. Castellano softly, as if reading his thoughts, you know this could take months, maybe years, and there's no guarantee she'll be able to stay clean. I know, replied Vinny, looking through the motel's dirty window at Detroit streets. But it's the right thing to do. Esperanza deserves the chance to know her biological mother, and Maria deserves the chance to redeem herself. And you? Asked the doctor. What do you deserve in this situation? Vinny didn't respond immediately. He thought about Esperanza, sleeping peacefully in her crib at the club, trusting him completely to protect and love her. He thought about how his life had changed in the past weeks, how he had discovered a capacity for love he didn't know he possessed. I deserve the chance to do the right thing, he said finally, even if that means sacrificing my own happiness. When the ambulance finally arrived and took Maria to the clinic, Vinny remained in the motel parking lot for a long time, looking at Detroit's gray sky. He had made a decision that could eventually cost him the most precious thing he had ever had, but he knew it was the right decision. Esperanza had entered his life as a miracle, awakening the best in him. Now he had to trust that no matter what happened, that awakening had changed not just his life, but who he was fundamentally. The path ahead was uncertain, full of challenges and difficult decisions. But one thing was clear. Vincent Torino was no longer the same man who had entered that alley 3 weeks ago. He had found his humanity again, and no matter what the future brought, he wouldn't lose it again. 6 months had passed since Maria Santos had entered the Serenity Hills Rehabilitation Clinic, a discreet and expensive facility located in Detroit's suburbs. During this time, Vincent Torino had lived a duality that consumed him daily. On one side, the pure joy of raising Esperanza, who was now 9 months old and had become the absolute center of his universe. On the other, the constant anxiety about what would happen when Maria was ready to reclaim her daughter. Esperanza had flourished under Vinny's care in a way that surprised even Dr. Castellano. The child who had been found nearly dead from cold was now a robust and happy baby with rosy cheeks and bright eyes that followed Vinny wherever he went. She had begun crawling the previous week, transforming the club into a minefield of potential dangers that Vinny had meticulously eliminated, installing outlet protectors, rounded corners on furniture, and safety gates on all stairs. On this July morning, Vinny was sitting on the floor of his office, watching Esperanza explore a pile of colorful blocks he had bought for her. The child had developed a distinct personality, curious, determined, and surprisingly stubborn when she wanted something. She had learned to say daddy a few weeks ago, a word that made Vinny's heart tighten every time he heard it. She's trying to stack the blocks, observed Salvatore, who had become an unofficial uncle to Esperanza. Look how she concentrates. It was true. Esperanza was determined to stack 3 blocks, but every time she managed to place the second one, her still developing coordination caused the tower to collapse. Instead of getting frustrated, she simply laughed and started again, her persistence reminding Vinny of himself in his early days, building his empire. The phone rang, interrupting the peaceful moment. Vinny answered, keeping an eye on Esperanza while he spoke. "Vinny, it's Dr. Castellano. I need to talk to you about Maria. Can you come to the clinic today?" The doctor's tone made Vinny's stomach contract. "Is she okay?" "Physically, yes. But there are some complications we need to discuss. It's better if we talk in person." Vinny looked at Esperanza, who had managed to stack 2 blocks and was clapping with joy. The idea of leaving her, even for a few hours, filled him with anxiety. In recent months, they rarely separated for more than a few hours. "Bring her with you," suggested Dr. Castellano, as if reading his thoughts. Actually, it might be important for her to come. An hour later, Vinny was driving through the tree-lined streets leading to Serenity Hills Clinic, with Esperanza secure in her car seat in the back, playing with a musical toy that played a soft melody. The clinic was an elegant complex that looked more like a resort than a medical facility, with well-maintained gardens and architecture that conveyed peace and recovery. Dr. Castellano met them at reception, his serious expression contrasting with the serene environment around them. "Vinny, thank you for coming. Maria is anxious to see you both." "How is she?" asked Vinny, adjusting Esperanza in his arms. The child was looking around with curiosity, her large eyes absorbing the new environment. "Physically, she's made remarkable progress. She's gained weight, her skin has recovered its healthy color, and all medical tests show she's been clean for 4 months. Dr. Castellano paused, choosing his words carefully. Psychologically, it's more complicated. They walked through the clinic's corridors, passing therapy rooms and recreation areas where other patients participated in various recovery activities. Vinny noticed how some staff members looked at him with discreet recognition. His reputation preceded him even in places like this. "What do you mean by complicated?" asked Vinny. "Maria has developed a fixation." "No, that's not the right word. She's developed a fantasy about what her life with Esperanza would be like. She talks about elaborate plans, about how happy they'll be together. But when therapists try to discuss practical aspects, where they'll live, how she'll support herself, how she'll deal with the triggers that led her to drugs, she becomes evasive or agitated." They stopped in front of a door marked with the number 15. Dr. Castellano turned to Vinny, his expression grave. "Vinny, I need you to understand something. Maria genuinely loves Esperanza. That was never in question. But love alone isn't enough to raise a child. And there's something else. He hesitated. She's developed a certain hostility toward you. Hostility? She sees you as someone who stole her daughter. In recent months, as her recovery progressed and her mind became clearer, she began questioning why you kept Esperanza instead of turning her over to authorities. She doesn't understand that you saved the child's life. Vinny felt a mixture of anger and sadness. He had spent the past months paying for the best possible treatment for Maria, visiting her regularly, ensuring she had everything she needed. And now he discovered she saw him as a villain. Does she want to see Esperanza? He asked. Yes, but Vinny, you need to be prepared. This could be a very difficult conversation. Dr. Castellano knocked on the door and opened it. The room was spacious and well lit, with a large window overlooking the clinic's gardens. Maria was sitting in an armchair near the window, and the transformation in her appearance was impressive. She had gained healthy weight, her hair was clean and shiny, and there was a clarity in her eyes that didn't exist when Vinny found her at the motel. But when she saw Esperanza in Vinny's arms, her expression changed completely. Her eyes filled with tears, and she stood up abruptly. "My baby," she whispered, extending her arms. "My little Esperanza." Esperanza looked at Maria with curiosity, but when the woman approached, the child clung more tightly to Vinny, hiding her face in his neck. It was an instinctive gesture from a child who didn't recognize the person in front of her. "She doesn't recognize me," said Maria, her voice breaking. "My own daughter doesn't recognize me." "Maria," said Dr. Castellano softly, "remember what we talked about regarding realistic expectations. Esperanza was very small when you separated, and when he took her from me," interrupted Maria, her eyes fixing on Vinny with an intensity that made him instinctively step back. "When this man decided he could simply keep my daughter." "Maria," said Vinny, his voice calm but firm, "you abandoned Esperanza in an alley to die. I saved her." "I left her where someone would find her," screamed Maria, her composure completely falling apart. "I never wanted her to die. I was sick, desperate, and had no choice." Esperanza began to cry, frightened by the shouting. Vinny instinctively rocked her, whispering soothing words in her ear until she calmed down. The simple, natural gesture seemed to enrage Maria even more. "Look how she calms down with you," she said, her voice loaded with bitterness. "You stole her from me. You made her forget me." "Nobody stole anything," replied Vinny, struggling to maintain calm. "I took care of her when she needed care. I loved her when she needed love, and I'll continue doing that for as long as necessary." "For as long as necessary?" Maria laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "She's my daughter. I'm her mother." "Being a mother is more than biology," said Vinny, the words coming out with more force than he intended. "It's being present. It's making sacrifices. It's putting the child's needs before your own. And you think you can do that better than I can?" asked Maria, approaching dangerously. "You, a criminal? You think you can give her a better life than I can?" The question hit Vinny like a punch. It was something he had questioned himself countless times in recent months. What kind of life could he offer Esperanza? What kind of future could a child have growing up in a mob boss's world? "I can give her love," he said finally. "I can give her stability. I can give her a family that will protect her with their lives." "A family of criminals," spat Maria. "What kind of example is that for a child?" Dr. Castellano intervened before the situation could escalate further. "Maybe we should take a break. Emotions are running too high right now." But Maria wasn't finished. "I want my daughter back," she said, her voice now cold and determined. "I'm her legal mother. I've recovered, I'm clean, and I want my daughter back." Maria," said Dr. Castellano carefully, "you still have several weeks of treatment ahead, and after that, you'll need a solid plan for—" "I have a plan," she interrupted. "I'm going to leave here, get a job, find an apartment, and raise my daughter, as it should have been from the beginning." Vinny looked at Esperanza, who had fallen asleep in his arms, despite the tension in the room. She seemed so small, so vulnerable. The idea of handing her over to an uncertain situation filled him with terror. "What if you relapse?" he asked. "What if you can't handle the stress of raising a child alone? What happens to Esperanza then?" "That won't happen," said Maria, but there was an uncertainty in her voice that didn't go unnoticed by anyone in the room. Maria, said Dr. Castellano, maybe we should consider a gradual arrangement. Supervised visits first, then. No, screamed Maria. She's my daughter. I don't need supervision to see my own daughter. The scream woke Esperanza, who began crying again. This time, she clung to Vinny with such force that her small nails left marks on his neck. It was clear the child was scared and confused. Look what you're doing to her, said Vinny, his own anger finally emerging. She's terrified. This is what you call maternal love? She's scared because you alienated her from me, replied Maria. You spent months making her think you're her father. I never told her I was her father, said Vinny, his voice dangerously low. But I have been the only father she's known. I have been the only one who was there when she was sick, when she was scared, when she needed someone. Because you prevented me from being there. I didn't prevent anything. You were in treatment because you almost died from an overdose. You were in treatment because you abandoned your daughter in an alley. The silence that followed was heavy and loaded with emotion. Maria began to cry, large tears rolling down her face. Esperanza had stopped crying, but remained clinging to Vinny, her large eyes observing the strange woman who seemed so disturbed. I know I made mistakes, said Maria finally, her voice broken. I know I did terrible things, but I've recovered, I've changed, and I want a chance to be the mother she deserves. Vinny looked at her, seeing not the angry woman from moments before, but the frightened girl he had found at the motel. Despite his anger, despite his fear of losing Esperanza, he could see the genuine pain in Maria's eyes. Maria, he said softly, I don't want to prevent you from knowing your daughter, but you need to understand that this can't be about what you want. It has to be about what's best for Esperanza. And you think living with a criminal is what's best for her? Asked Maria, but her voice had lost some of its previous hostility. Vinny didn't respond immediately. It was a question that haunted him, a question for which he had no easy answer. Finally, he looked at Dr. Castellano. Doctor, what's your professional recommendation? Doctor. Castellano sighed, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. Professionally, I would recommend a gradual transition. Supervised visits first, then unsupervised visits, and eventually, if everything goes well, a complete transition. But, he hesitated, that's assuming Maria completes her treatment successfully and demonstrates long-term stability. How long would that take? Asked Vinny. Months, maybe a year or more. Maria went pale. A year? You want me to wait a year to get my daughter back? I want you to prove you can be the mother Esperanza needs, replied Dr. Castellano, and that takes time. Vinny looked at Esperanza, who had calmed down and was now playing with the buttons of his shirt, completely oblivious to the conversation that would determine her future. He thought about all the moments they had shared, the nights when she had awakened crying and he had consoled her, the mornings when she had smiled at him as if he were the most wonderful thing in the world, the first steps she would take soon. But he also thought about Maria, about her pain, about her right as the biological mother. And he thought about the kind of man he wanted to be, not just for Esperanza, but for himself. All right, he said finally, the words coming out as if they were torn from his soul. Let's try supervised visits, but with conditions. Maria lifted her head, hope shining in her eyes. First condition, you complete your treatment here, no exceptions. Second, you undergo regular psychological evaluations to ensure you're stable. Third, visits start small, 1 hour per week with Dr. Castellano present. And if I agree to all of this? Asked Maria. Vinny looked at Esperanza once more, memorizing her face, her smell, the feeling of her small body in his arms. Then we'll see what's best for her, he said. Because in the end, that's what matters. Not what I want, not what you want, but what's best for Esperanza. It was the most difficult decision Vincent Torino had ever made, more difficult than any business deal, any confrontation, any choice in his criminal life. But as he looked at the child who had changed his life, he knew it was the right decision. The price of redemption he was discovering. was sometimes having to give up the thing you love most. 8 months had passed since that first tense visit at Serenity Hills Clinic, and Vincent Torino's world had transformed in ways he never could have imagined. Esperanza was now a year and a half old, a vibrant and curious child who had learned to walk, speak simple words, and win the hearts of everyone around her with her captivating personality and radiant smile. The supervised visits with Maria had begun hesitantly and tensely, but gradually evolved into something more natural and comforting. Maria had completed her rehabilitation program with distinction, demonstrating not only physical sobriety, but also emotional and psychological growth that impressed even the most skeptical therapists. She had gotten a job as a receptionist at a medical clinic, found a modest but clean apartment in a safe neighborhood, and most importantly, had developed a genuine and loving relationship with Esperanza. On this March afternoon, Vinny was sitting on a bench in Riverside Park, watching Maria push Esperanza on a children's swing. The sound of the child's laughter echoed through the park, mixing with the sounds of spring arriving in Detroit, birds singing, children playing, and the distant murmur of the Detroit River. It was a domestic and peaceful scene that contrasted dramatically with the life Vinny had known for decades. "Higher, Mommy! Higher!" shouted Esperanza, her small hands gripping the swing chains tightly. She had begun calling Maria Mommy a few months ago, a transition that had been both painful and necessary for Vinny to accept. "Not too high, my little one," replied Maria, her voice full of the affection that had flourished during months of carefully supervised visits. "We don't want you to fly away." Vinny smiled despite the melancholy that always accompanied him during these visits. Seeing Maria and Esperanza together had become easier with time, but would never cease to be bittersweet. He could see the genuine love between mother and daughter, could see how Esperanza had adapted to Maria's presence in her life, and knew he was witnessing something beautiful and right. Dr. Castellano approached and sat beside Vinny on the bench. At 61 years old, the doctor had become more than just a hired professional. He had become a confidant, a counselor, and perhaps the closest thing to a true friend Vinny had had in years. "How are you feeling today?" asked the doctor, observing the interaction between Maria and Esperanza. "Like always," replied Vinny, proud of her, happy to see her so content, and terrified of what's to come. It was true. In recent weeks, it had become clear that Maria was ready for the next step: unsupervised visits and eventually complete custody of Esperanza. All psychological reports were positive. Her living situation was stable, and most importantly, her bond with Esperanza had strengthened to the point where the child clearly felt safe and loved in her presence. "Vinny," said Dr. Castellano carefully, "you know the time has come, don't you?" Vinny nodded, not trusting his voice to respond. He had known this day would come since the moment he agreed to supervised visits. Logically, he had always known Maria would eventually reclaim her daughter. Emotionally, however, he had allowed himself to hope that maybe, somehow, they could find an arrangement that would allow him to remain a central part of Esperanza's life. "Has she mentioned anything to you?" asked Vinny. "Yesterday. She wants to talk to you about the transition. She has some proposals." Before Vinny could respond, Esperanza came running toward him, her small arms extended and a huge smile lighting up her face. "Daddy Vinny! Daddy Vinny! Did you see how high I flew?" Vinny caught her in the air, spinning her once before hugging her against his chest. The title, Daddy Vinny, had been a compromise solution that Maria had suggested months ago, a way to acknowledge Vinny's role in Esperanza's life without confusing the child about her biological origins. "I saw Principessa," he said, using the Italian nickname he had given her. "You were flying like a little bird. Mommy said we can feed the ducks after," said Esperanza, pointing to the small lake where several families were scattering breadcrumbs for ducks swimming lazily in the water. "That sounds like a wonderful adventure," replied Vinny, setting her down. "Go tell Mommy we're ready." As Esperanza ran back to Maria, Dr. Castellano observed Vinny carefully. "You're handling this better than I expected." "Am I?" Vinny laughed, but there was no humor in the sound, because inside, I feel like I'm dying a little more each day. That's normal, Vinny. You raised this child for more than a year. She became your daughter in every way that matters except biologically. Then why am I doing this? Asked Vinny, his voice loaded with a pain he rarely allowed others to see. Why am I giving up the most precious thing in my life to someone who abandoned her? Because, said Dr. Castellano softly, you've become the man you always had the potential to be. Because you're doing what's right for Esperanza, even if it means sacrificing your own happiness. They walked to the lake, where Maria was helping Esperanza throw pieces of bread to the ducks. The child laughed delightedly every time a duck approached to get the food, and Maria smiled with a joy that Vinny had rarely seen during the first months of visits. Vinny, said Maria when he approached, can we talk after Esperanza finishes feeding the ducks? Of course, he replied, though his stomach contracted with anxiety. 20 minutes later, while Esperanza played on a nearby playground under Dr. Castellano's watchful eye, Maria and Vinny sat on a bench overlooking the lake. The silence between them was comfortable now, very different from the hostile tension that had characterized their first encounters. Vinny, began Maria, I want you to know that I'll never forget what you did for Esperanza. You saved her life, and more than that, you loved her when she most needed love. Vinny nodded, not trusting his voice. I also want you to know that I understand how difficult this must be for you. I see how she looks at you, how she lights up when you arrive. You're not just Daddy Vinny to her. You're really a father to her. Maria, began Vinny, but she raised her hand. Let me finish, please. I spent a lot of time angry at you, blaming you for stealing my daughter. But I understand now that you didn't steal anything. You filled a void that I created with my own choices. She paused, looking at Esperanza, who was bravely climbing a small climbing structure. I want full custody of Esperanza, she said finally, but I don't want you to disappear from her life. Vinny looked at her, surprised. What do you mean? I mean you'll always be welcome in our lives. Regular visits, holidays together, maybe even occasional vacations. Esperanza needs you, Vinny. She needs the love and stability you can offer. And you're comfortable with that? Asked Vinny, barely daring to believe what he was hearing. Comfortable having a man like me involved in your daughter's life? Maria smiled, and for the first time since they'd met, it was a genuinely warm smile. Vinny, I don't care what you do for a living. I care about the kind of man you are with my daughter. And with her, you're gentle, protective, loving. You're exactly the kind of father figure I'd want her to have. Vinny felt tears sting his eyes, an emotion he had learned not to repress in recent months. Maria, you don't know what this means to me. I do, she said softly, because I see in your eyes the same love I feel for her. They sat in silence for a few minutes, watching Esperanza play. The child had made friends with another boy on the playground and was sharing her toys with the natural generosity that characterized her personality. There's one more thing, said Maria. I want you to know that if anything happens to me, if I relapse, if I get sick, anything, I want Esperanza to go to you. Legally. I've already talked to a lawyer about this. Vinny looked at her, shocked. Maria, I know you'll do anything to protect her, she said. I trust you with her life, Vinny, completely. At that moment, Esperanza came running toward them, her arms extended to both. Mommy, Daddy Vinny, come play with me. Maria and Vinny stood up, each taking one of Esperanza's small hands. As they walked back to the playground, Vinny felt something he hadn't felt in months. Hope. Maybe this wasn't a goodbye after all. Maybe it was the beginning of something new, something different, but equally valuable. An unconventional family, built not on biology or legalities, but on love, sacrifice, and the understanding that a child's well-being was more important than any personal desire. In the weeks that followed, the transition happened gradually. First, Esperanza spent one night a week at Maria's apartment, then an entire weekend. Finally, she moved permanently with Maria, but continued to visit Vinny regularly. The Torino family club was never the same. The crib remained in Vinny's office, now used during Esperanza's visits. Toys were still scattered in corners, and Vinny's men had gotten used to having a child running through the corridors during weekends. More importantly, Vincent Torino was never the same. The experience of loving and raising Esperanza had changed something fundamental in him. He still ran his organization, still made difficult decisions, still commanded respect and fear on Detroit's streets. But now there was a humanity in his actions that hadn't existed before. He began using his influence to protect other vulnerable children in the city. He established anonymous funds for rehabilitation clinics and youth shelters. And whenever his men brought information about children in danger, Vincent Torino personally ensured they received the help they needed. On a December night, exactly 2 years after finding Esperanza in that alley, Vinny was sitting in his office, watching the 3-year-old child play with a set of building blocks. Maria was in the club's kitchen, preparing hot chocolate, a tradition they had developed for their winter visits. "Daddy Vinny," said Esperanza, looking up from her elaborate construction. "Are you happy?" It was a simple question, asked with the direct innocence of a child. But it hit Vinny straight in the heart. He looked at her bright eyes, her confident smile, her vibrant personality that illuminated any environment she entered. "Yes, Principessa," he said, picking her up. "I'm very happy." And it was true. His life hadn't unfolded the way he had imagined when he found Esperanza in that alley. He wasn't her primary father, didn't see her every day, wasn't the first person she looked for when she was scared or hurt. But he was loved by her, and she by him, and that had proven to be enough. Maria entered the office carrying 3 mugs of hot chocolate, her face radiant with the happiness that had become her default expression in recent months. "Did someone order hot chocolate?" "Me! Me!" shouted Esperanza, extending her small hands. As the 3 sat together, sharing hot chocolate and stories from the day, Vinny reflected on the journey that had brought them to this point. It had begun with abandonment and despair, but had evolved into something beautiful, an unconventional but genuine family. Esperanza had taught them all about the true meaning of family. It wasn't about blood or legalities or social conventions. It was about love, sacrifice, and the willingness to put a child's well-being above all other desires. Vincent Torino had entered that alley as a man hardened by time and circumstances. He had emerged as a father, a protector, and perhaps most importantly, as a man who had rediscovered his humanity. And as he watched Esperanza laugh with Maria about something silly that had happened at the park that day, he knew that every sacrifice, every moment of pain, every difficult decision had been worth it, because in the end, he had helped create not just a happy and healthy child, but a family based on the kind of love that transcends all barriers. And that, Vincent Torino knew, was the greatest legacy any man could leave. The small voice that had said "mommy" in that cold alley had changed everything. It had awakened a heart he thought was dead, had shown him that redemption was possible, and had proven that even in the most unlikely circumstances, love always finds a way. Esperanza had been abandoned to die, but instead, she had brought life. Life to Vincent, life to Maria, and life to everyone who had been lucky enough to know her. She had been the small voice that whispered hope in the darkness, and that hope had transformed into something much greater than any of them could have imagined. The true meaning of family, they had learned, wasn't in how you started, but in how you chose to continue. And they had chosen to continue together, united by love for a child who had changed all their lives for the better.